Hello everyone, welcome to this Roundup. When we look at the advances in energy technology in oil and gas, renewables, nuclear and other emerging sectors, there is a clear and visible evidence that the advances in technology has changed the geopolitics of energy industry dramatically and rapidly. It is due to the advances in energy technology that nations have made a very convincing move from an era of energy resource scarcity to an era of energy resource abundance. In addition, nations have moved from a geographical concentration of energy resources to universality of its access. And perhaps the most important development is there is no longer monopoly power of oil and gas as the stiff competition between shale, oil, renewables, nuclears, and many other sectors of energy is intensifying and becoming very rewarding to consumers. Having said that, the rapidly changing geopolitics of energy security is still a harsh reminder that the supposedly golden age of energy security, where each and every nation will have the ability to secure affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy supplies to maintain the respective nation's power requirement, is still perhaps more of an illusion. Even today, in a digital global age, energy security is a complex challenge and is very unique and different for each and every nation. So when we evaluate energy security, the biggest obstacle to energy security is not a lack of energy resources. There are plenty of resources. It is the policy choices nations make, for better or for worse, that have the largest impact on each nation's energy security. While understanding policy and advances in technology are very important, it is also important to understand, evaluate, and manage the energy security pressure points across nations that choke the security of the global energy markets, especially the production, transportation, and distribution of energy. Climate preparedness has become a very important factor of energy security. However, in the interest of the time allotted for this session of Risk Roundup, climate preparedness will be left for discussion for another day. To discuss the energy security risk further, I'm delighted to welcome John Saucer on Risk Roundup. John is the Vice President, Research and Analysis at Mobius Risk Group. Welcome, John. We're delighted to have you on Risk Roundup.
Thanks for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Wonderful, John. So before we start, for the benefit of our global viewers and listeners, let's talk about what is a secure energy system. What is a secure energy system?
Well, a secure energy system would be a system that would allow not just locating the energy, but delivering the energy to consumers in a smooth and efficient a fashion that's not sensitive to disruption, whether those disruptions come from weather-related events, economic-related events, or geopolitical events.
That's a very good explanation, John. So if we look at the energy security globally, what common threats do you see at this point?
I would say on the affirmative side, there's abundant evidence that shale resources are going to be discovered pretty much everywhere around the globe. The only places that we don't have meaningful measurements on shale reserves is places where that said, at the end of the day, transporting those molecules, whether they're natural gas, oil, or refined products to the markets they're needed, will prove to be more challenging. That will require a lot of investment. That will also require political decisions and geopolitical negotiation decisions and moving those across territories that haven't had a precedent of doing it before or may not be on the most friendly terms historically.
Yes, no, that's very true. I agree to that. Now, you talked about shale. Now, if we look at the shale sector, especially in the United States, we have made a lot of progress. And as you said that, we have found a lot of, reserves all over the world. But from what I hear, that not everyone, it looks like not all the nations are probably going to benefit from having that shale. And I'm trying to understand what are the reasons behind it. Can you share some lights to that?
Yes, I would think there it comes to the issue of stability and confidence of where you're going to put your investments. Whether you're a U.S. company or an international firm, you want your investments in an environment that has dependable rule of law, dependable taxation, dependable accounting parameters. So the U.S. and North America has always been a magnet. There's been a great deal of discussion about shale reserves in Europe and places like Poland. There's been a great deal of discussion about shale reserves in Latin America, like places like Argentina. But both those have unique challenges. And right now, as we've seen, people have flocked to sort of the U.S. and Canada because I think it'd be a very friendly business climate.
I see. So it's more of the environment or the policies of the governments or the geopolitical risk and terrorism and all that probably that plays a role. It's nothing to do about the technology or ability to get the shale gas out. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct because a lot of the advances technologically, scientifically, and efficiency-wise we've made over the last years could be applied in other places. Again, it's confidence in where you're going to have your investment for all those reasons. I think even in the U.S., you can see there's a fairly significant difference between even certain states. Obviously, there's been a lot more investment in Texas, which is a very energy-friendly state, great resources. But even if you look at the Northeast and the Marcellus and Utica shales, that natural gas, that prolific basin, there's a very large differential between what you can do in Ohio, what you can do in West Virginia, relative to what you can do in Pennsylvania, and especially in places like New York. There's a lot of untapped shale resources in neighboring states, and that's all untapped because of regulatory and government decisions.
Right. No, that's very true. Now, each nation, John, from what I'm hearing is that they prioritize and address the triple imperatives of energy security, that is accessibility, affordability, and sustainability in different ways. Can you explain to our global viewers and listeners why energy security is very different to different nations? I mean, what is security to us is not security to China, is not security to probably Canada or Mexico. Can you shed some light to that?
Well, I think part of it is that so much in the case of history, but even true now, a lot of the abundance of energy resources aren't necessarily in the consuming markets, in the developing markets where you're seeing the demand development. So transportation became key, whether it's pipeline transportation, waterborne transportation, what have you. And as we've seen historically, pipelines can be vulnerable to a lot of issues. In this case, not so much weather, but certainly geopolitics. We've seen that in Latin America and Colombia with their pipelines and the strife they've had with the guerrilla factions there. We've seen it in northern Iraq recently with the Kurdish regime moving barrels into Turkey. And there's a lot of concern about that going forward because a lot of the abundance of scale, whether it's in China or in Central Asia, is going to have to move by pipeline across long and unproven routes. I'll just say it that way.
Yes, no, that is very true. Now, John, technical and technology innovations from shale gas to oil have revolutionized this nation, our United States, energy outlook. Now, the United States is perhaps the world's fastest growing oil producer, achieving what would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. Now, the global energy investment climate, it seems that is also shifting very rapidly. What is the impact of shale on the global energy markets from your perspective?
Well, I'll first address price. With the drop in prices over the last 18 to 24 months, we've seen global capital expenditures cut anywhere from 20 to 25%. And that's going to have long-term ramifications because there's going to be a huge lag time going forward to get that dialed back up. But in the case of shale, I think people want dependability, and I think that's why the focus has been on shale is more like mining. It's more like manufacturing. You sort of take the exploration out of exploration and production. It's about the entities or the companies or the capital that can most efficiently manufacture those molecules and get them to the market. So I think that's key. And I think that's one reason that even within the U.S., there's been sort of a migration in capital away from the complex, deep water, long lag time projects to the more predictable, shorter duration, shale-oriented development. And I think you'll see that with the international majors too going forward.
Right. Now, the breakthrough nuclear deal with Iran, it seems it has major implications for global energy markets and also the regional power balances. What impact do you see on the global markets and energy security overall?
Well, I think it's good news for Europe in that much of the market share that Iran lost during the period of sanctions was market share in Europe, and they will in fact be competing to capture that. So that will benefit, the importers and the oil consumers in Europe quite a bit. In terms of the global marketplace, I think the impact on prices has been less than expected. I think that's partially derived from the fact that Iran has produced, I think, a bit less than what people were anticipating in 2016 so far, and B, as is always the case, there's always surprises. And again, we've had some geopolitical and supply developments in OPEC, whether it's Nigeria, northern Iraq, Venezuela, that has sort of counteracted the impact on markets of these Iranian barrels coming back to the global marketplace.
I see, I see. Now, there are some who say that the three greatest threats of modern energy security are complacency, uncertainty, and ideology. Now, nations have forever tried to manage the complex challenges of energy security. Do you think because of these three threats, that the main threats, I would say, the greatest threats, do you think that nations would ever be able to see real energy security?
I think that probably the technological component will be the greatest contributor to that, because if we make breakthroughs, whether it's with nuclear technology, energy storage and battery technology, superconductivity, that will benefit everybody uniformly, and I think that'll be sort of outside the realm of politics. When you try to strip away regional strife, religious strife, just long-term grudges, for lack of a better term, that's much more difficult. I think that would take a lot more time, and we see that bubble up to this day, and I think that will continue. It may not be in the same places, it may not be over the same assets, but that's something that's sort of with the history of mankind that's going to be with us for a while. But I think it's the technological advances that will make the biggest difference in
yes,
the way.
yes. That is true. That is true. Technology will make a big difference. Now, from your perspective, how secure are European gas markets at this point?
European gas market?
Yes.
I think they're far more secure they've been in a while, because I think what you're seeing in European gas markets are, the Russians know that they will have to compete going forward. Their pipeline gas will have to compete head-to-head with natural gas that will be sourced as LNG on the U.S. Gulf Coast and move into European markets. I think they also are already facing pretty stiff competition in Europe from LNG that's being sourced in Qatar. And I think in those two cases, that'll make for a more commercial market, and one that's less sort of susceptible to using natural gas as a weapon on their neighbors or on Western Europe. So I think there's going to be an abundance and a much more commercial natural gas market in Europe going forward.
Yes, yes. Now, there is a growing voice for unrestricted trade in hydrocarbons, especially oil and gas markets, across many nations, including probably United States. Do you think it will happen? And if it does, what impact do you see on the global markets?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part of that sentence that broke up?
There is a growing voice for unrestricted trade in hydrocarbons. That means oil and gas markets. Now, it's not just United States, but across many other nations, this is, there is a growing voice for that. Now, do you think it will happen, unrestricted trade in hydrocarbons? And if it does happen, unrestricted trade, what impact do you see on the global energy markets?
I think I'll address the second part of that first. I think if we had the unrestricted trade, it would make for a more efficient global market, because there are a tremendous amount of inefficiencies that are still with us, that have been with us dating back to the real beginning of the energy market in oil in the late 70s with the North Sea spot market. If you look at some of the largest producers, particularly those in OPEC, they don't really encourage a free marketed trade in their oil. They really limit their sales to end users or refiners. They don't allow retrade. That, I think, reduces transparency, reduces liquidity, and reduces efficiency. So in a future where some of the largest producers, not just the North Sea or the U.S., but some of those in OPEC that allowed much more free trade in their own grades or their own crudes, that would make, you see it much more in the refined products than you do the crude. Many nations still view, their crude as a very special sovereign resource that they want to maintain as much control over as possible.
Right, right. Now, energy security challenges, as we talked earlier, also it comes from nations' governments and the policies, and nation. What we face I mean, even today, what we face in a digital global age, because of the nation's government policies, the complex energy challenges are not simple. What is the best way for governments, from your perspective, to address the energy security challenges through regulatory and policy, decisions that they make?
Well, I think there needs to be a bit more realism, and I think I know this could be viewed as a bit naive, but a little bit less political posturing, because I think you can use a great example in the U.S. Sort of the debate over pipelines and the construction of pipelines. I'll give two examples. The Keystone Pipeline never being built. At the end of the day, that may not make that much difference, because during the 6 years that was being discussed, being debated, being protested, what have you, scores of other pipelines were built in the same area to move the same molecules. But there was also sort of this notion too during that same period of time where we saw a tremendous boost in the crude by rail business, or where they went from moving very little crude to tremendous amounts of crude, almost 1 million barrels a day of crude by railroad. Clearly, moving it by railroad is less efficient. Clearly, moving it by railroad is less environmentally friendly. And clearly, moving it by railroad creates a tremendous amount of potential environmental risk going forward. Yet, that was somehow politically acceptable when symbolically a single pipeline across the mid-continent wasn't. And I think anybody that's stepped back and looked at a pipeline grid map in the U.S., whether it's crude oil, refined products, or natural gas, would quickly realize that pipelines are absolutely everywhere already.
Yes, yes, no, that's very true. And the complex security is that roads or tankers or trains that transport the crude, that makes it much more complex. So I hear your point on that. Now, unlike the globally integrated oil market, natural gas markets are segmented due to limited pipeline connections and high transportation costs for globally traded liquefied natural gas. Now, what security risk does this bring to global energy markets?
Well, it makes the market less efficient, because you just don't have the free flexibility to move the energy molecules in the form of natural gas as needed. If there's a particularly cold winter in Europe, or a particularly cold event even in the northeastern U.S., these regions can become incredibly isolated, and their pricing will reflect that. And you may see $2 natural gas to go. And likewise, the same thing can unfold in Europe too. So, part of it is just logistics. It's difficult to build a pipeline, so we have to have the LNG, and obviously there's a lag time there. But going forward, the flexibility provided by the new LNG export capacity, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Australia, whether it's along the U.S. Gulf Coast, is going to make a huge difference and really take that next step to integrating the market like we already see with oil and products.
Yes, yes, no, that's very true. Now, let's talk about the pressure points of the global energy markets. For the security of the global energy markets, what are some important pressure points that you see that United States need to monitor, especially, if you're looking at the excess of, our energy requirements?
Well, I think looking at it globally and looking at oil, there's a lot of really sensitive pressure points right now geopolitically that could become sort of fulcrums going forward. And many of them aren't even in the Middle East. I would think that West Africa is one we have to watch very closely, because both Angola and Nigeria have done a tremendous amount in terms of providing additional crude oil capacity expansions in the last few years. But they're bumping up against some of the problems they faced in the past, whether it's lack of investment, or more critically, instability in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, directly affecting the ability to export crude. Case in point, right now, just since February, we've seen attacks on key export terminals, one in Fort Cottos, one at Brass River, that's right now curtailing about 400,000 barrels a day. That bubbles up unexpectedly, and right now that's not an issue, because obviously we've got shale production and plenty of oil in inventory, but we can't really control when that bubbles up. Likewise, another good example would be Venezuela right now. So far, their production has been largely steady, but they're facing a huge fiscal crisis that could directly impact their ability to export. And in their case, they need to import light crude and diluents to lighten up their crude, to make a lot of that heavy crude available for exports. If they can't afford to purchase that, or they don't have the foreign reserves and liquidity to do that, then their exports could go down just because they don't have the material they need to make the crude they need suitable for export. And obviously we have a lot unfolding in the Middle East. There's not a big geopolitical premium right now in the market tied to that, and I think that's fairly valid. But we are beginning to see, less consistency in terms of Iraq's ability to maintain its new higher level of exports. And we all know that in general, there's not a lot of spare production capacity, virtually zero and limited enough to know that plus or minus a little bit, global demand is going to grow by more than 1 million barrels a year each and every year going forward.
Right, I know that. I understand what you're saying now. It seems that the security of supply is the defining principle behind these choke points that we are talking about, that is the production, transportation, distribution. And perhaps production, transportation are more relevant to the security that we are talking about. Now, how secure, not for United States, but how secure is the global supply from a production and transportation standpoint, if you look at the overall global supply chain, energy supply chain?
Well, there's still a lot of the natural geographic choke points too. I mean, whether you're talking about the Suez Canal and the Suez pipeline linking the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, whether you're talking about the pipelines that move Central Asian crude and Iraqi crude through Turkey into the Mediterranean, whether you're talking about the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, all the choke points that were problematic for us 20, 30, and 40 years ago are still problematic for us because all these crudes are moving. At the very least, it creates situations where if those aren't available, the distance traveled is going to be far greater. And anytime the distance traveled for those barrels is greater, that reduces your capacity to deliver by a material amount. So that's one area that hasn't changed. And really it's become more important because obviously we're seeing huge growth in the Indian subcontinent and China, much of it derived from crude oil imports. So it's not just the U.S. now. It's not just Europe. It's bidirectional, whether it's east of Suez or heading into the Atlantic Basin.
Yes, that is very true. Now, it seems that the physical security, the way I describe is geosecurity. So the geosecurity and cybersecurity are the pressure point in production, transportation, and distribution. Now, are they viewed in silo, or nations have an integrated approach to these pressure points? Because of this, digitalization capability and digitalization process that is going on, and because of the internet and the information communication technology, everything is changing. Cyberspace has changed each and every industry, and energy industry is no different, though it is changing a bit slower than the other industries, but it is still changing, and that makes the interconnectedness and interdependencies between the geosecurity and cybersecurity play a very significant role. So from your perspective, what is your observation about how the industry and the nations are having an approach to integrated approach to these pressure points, or is it like silo that only cybersecurity people focus on the cybersecurity aspect and physical security, geosecurity people focus on that, or there is a real integrated, unified approach to address this growing interconnectedness and interdependencies?
I think there's a huge way to go and a long path to travel to where we have an integrated approach. And I think that's even true when you're looking at some of the more developed oil industries, whether it's in places like Saudi Arabia with a well-advanced state oil company, or even with the U.S. and international majors. The cyber and the technology and the digital nature of it makes security that much more difficult because, as we all know, each ship, each parcel can be tracked both by the good guys and the bad guys. So there's a lot more transparency, and that can work for good or for ill. I also think that so many producers, particularly in a low price environment, but even this was true at higher prices, are struggling to make ends meet fiscally. And that oftentimes takes their eye off the ball in the sense that they don't have the focus, nor do they have the capital to invest in the type of infrastructure, invest in the type of manpower, or invest in the skill sets they need to really address it, let alone on a highly integrated nature. So, there's a huge gap to fill there. And I think that's why, quite frankly, even though we've come a long way digitally, in many ways, when you look at the choke points and the problems in the oil industry, they feel very much the same as they felt, 10, 15, 20 years ago. The information's there, but it hasn't been integrated, not nearly far enough.
Right, right, and that makes it more vulnerable also. Now, if we talk about the crisis in Ukraine, that is probably the latest reminder of how energy permeates the geopolitical landscape and is still a very fundamental element of national power. It could be a source of political leverage, or it could be a great vulnerability for some nations, and can promote either economic prosperity or instability. Can you share your insights as to how geopolitics impacts global energy markets, especially with the reference to Ukraine?
Well, I think with Ukraine, it's a good example. We were talking about the European gas market earlier. If you go back 1 year, 2 years, you can see where natural gas was being wielded as a very specific weapon directed at Ukraine and or anybody in Europe that was supporting Ukraine relative to the Russian leadership. Going forward, that may still exist, but it's much more difficult now for those commercial terms. The reality of the situation now is that Russia has leverage but can't use it because they are in a cash-constrained situation, and they now have to compete much more aggressively with LNG-based natural gas supplies. So that's evolved quite dramatically from a situation where Russia could use their natural gas with a tremendous amount of leverage to one where that's not likely to be the case going forward, and less likely to be the case as we get more and more LNG export capability around the world.
Right, right. No, that is true. Now, the global energy market trend is causing some nations to assume new roles in the production, consumption, distribution, and trade of energy. Now, as the oil demand in advanced economies, that is the Western economies, is in a slow structural decline, and developing economies now dominate energy consumption growth, the geographic center of global energy demand seems to have moved from west to east. If market changes are one reason to examine the changing relationship between energy and national security, market failures also plays an obviously important role. Now, in the context of interconnected and interdependent energy markets, do you think that the shared energy security needs to be the priority and focus of each nation? And will that ever happen that nations collectively will look at this shared energy risk and shared energy security at the same time?
I think they will. I think it'll take time, but I think they absolutely have. And your point about the geographical shift and where the demand growth is going to be important, because you're going from a very westernized Atlantic Basin focused market to one that's rapidly evolving on many fronts, not just commercially but also politically and otherwise. You're moving from areas where you've had established democracy for a long period of time to fledgling democracy and countries that are just now finding their economic wheel. So absolutely, I think there will have to be coordination, and
That is good.
Maybe it'd be a consumer type of I don't want to call it a cartel or an OPEC-like organization, but maybe some of the largest importers or consumers of crude oil and refined products, whether it's China, India, or any of the smaller developing nations there, they will have to get together because it will be in their best interest to coordinate and have some sort of pushback against producers, but also just shared experience, whether it's on the security front, whether it's on the economic front, or what have you. But absolutely.
Yes, yes. No, I absolutely agree on that. I think you are right that it will be more regional to start with, where they all will start working together for the benefit of their security. Now, renewables have penetrated the electricity sector and transportation in the form of biofuels, I think, and due to subsidies, some other national policy supports and cost reduction, they have made a lot of headways. Now, wind and solar are probably among the fastest growing sources of electricity, but they are growing from a very small base, and capacity also is very small compared to existing levels of fossil fuel generation that we see across nation. Now, ethanol fuel has grown to roughly 10% from what I came across the information. 10% of the gasoline pool. Now, do you think renewables has the potential to displace oil and fossil fuels in the coming years?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we have tremendous growth, and I'm going to use the wind and the solar power, but you can't have that alone. Really, for those to work most efficiently, they have to be integrated into a system where you have good base load. And that base load is going to have to come from whether it's hydrocarbon or whether it's nuclear, or in some cases hydropower. So, because of the huge variability in demand across the day, because of the huge variability in supply of wind and solar due to weather and time of day, they can never stand on their own. But you can see where you get a much more integrated system where solar and wind complement baseload natural gas or additional nuclear plants. And certainly that will spell sort of the end of and we're already seeing it, coal-fired and oil-fired plants. That'll happen first in North America. It's obviously well underway, but I would think that we'll see that sort of evolve on a global basis. But it's just very expensive because you have to build both capacity simultaneously. You can get too far ahead in the wind and the solar, and all of a sudden you don't have the power you need at the time of day you need in the place you need. You still have to have that base load, and that base load is going to have to come from natural gas, nuclear, or something that's dependable.
Yes, that is true. That is true. Now, it seems that the complex political and security landscape in Middle East and also North Africa, combined with low oil prices that we have currently, it creates unprecedented security challenges for not only the policymakers in those nations, but I think all nations. What are those challenges? Because these two regions bring so many complex security challenges, and with the low oil price, it is creating some critical risk that we all nations will have to face.
Well, I think addressing North Africa and West Africa specifically, that presents some very unique challenges to Europe. Europe's own domestic production, North Sea crude production, has sort of peaked out and should go into sort of long-term terminal decline here. And really, they depend on that proximity, that short-haul nature. Northern African crude, whether it's Algerian crude or Libyan crude or Egyptian crude or West African crude from Gabon, Nigeria, or Angola, have been sort of staple in terms of providing short-haul supplies. And you're much more sensitive when you lose those because there's just not that lag time. And, in all those examples, you've got incredible fiscal pressure on the governments, and in some cases, obviously, you have a much more acute political problem, like in the case of Libya, where the infrastructure is controlled by warring factions on any given day. You're lucky to have any progress or movement of barrels out into the global marketplace.
Right, and they also have the threat of ISIS, right, in those two regions, and even in North Africa, they also have a lot of internal conflicts, and also with the neighboring countries. So, and the leadership is also not very effective. So, they're very complex security challenges that the energy sector faces over there. Now, what role does the growing possibility of decarbonization of the global economy plays in the energy security? We are not going to address more of this, but just very briefly how it impacts the current energy markets.
The decarbonization?
Yes.
Well, obviously, some of those countries that are almost entirely dependent on oil exports are going to have huge issues going forward because, as you alluded to earlier, even with growth in the developing Eastern economies, east of Suez, is that enough to offset the type of slowdown or reversal of demand growth we're seeing in some of the largest G20 or industrialized countries? We also haven't even addressed the impact of a technological breakthrough, whether it's battery storage capabilities, whether it's superconductivity, whether something just on the simple fuel efficiency front in automobiles and motor vehicles. Those could all be game changers, and I think it's fairly naive not to recognize that potential exists out there. So it could create some dramatic problems for some of these smaller exporters that are 100% dependent, but it could have a huge impact on some of the larger exporters too. I don't think anybody, whether they're OPEC, GCC countries, Northern and Western Africa, are going to be immune from a step change or a ratchet or a game changer like that.
That is true. That is true. Now, it seems, let's talk about our neighbor country, Mexico. It seems that they are going through some energy reform. What do you think is the impact of this Mexico's energy reform?
Well, I would divide it in two. So I'll start with where it's been very successful and very rapid. In the power sector and in the natural gas sector, we've seen a huge evolution over the past 2 years. We've seen a lot of independent power producers go in there to beef up electrical generation capacity. They're trying to bring electricity to broader swaths of the country. They're trying to make the grid more dependable across the entire country, and that's led to a huge uptick in U.S. natural gas exports to Mexico to sort of integrate those two countries. Eventually, Mexico will be able to produce their own natural gas from shale. That will require time and capital that may not be available to them right now. But in general, that's where they've pressed on with the most level of success. The flip side is that the outside investment they need to sort of stem the downturn that's now basically a decade old in their crude production has been slower. And that's partly due to, the type of properties that were made available early on, and partly due to the fact that we've just had a tremendous amount of pain in the global oil industry tied to low oil prices. It's just not that investment capital. When you're slashing CapEx across the globe, when you're slashing body counts of companies across the globe, it certainly takes the motivation away and makes, a foray into a new property or a new industry in Mexico a little bit less attractive. That's not to say the long-term prospects aren't there, but this is more of a hiccup there. One of Mexico's largest issues, and I think they're addressing it right now, is refining. Their oil demand, their gasoline demand, their diesel demand is growing tremendously, and the refining capacity is not. They've got tens of billions of dollars of upgrades and repairs and tweaks they need to do. And even if they did them, they're still in a position where they have to increasingly import refined products. And that's a very difficult position to be in, where you're exporting crude at a diminishing rate and then importing refined products at an increasing rate. So that's something they have to address right away. So, that's the real pressure point for them. Crude long-term, they'll be fine, but it's going to take some time for the industry to turn around. And they've made a huge progress in the power and natural gas side, and that should continue.
Right. No, I agree with your point on that, but it seems the investments also are moving away from deep water and shale resources towards shallow water and onshore resources. And it seems, if we talk about Mexico, that many of these are still in the hands of Pemex, right? And are more accessible to the private industry than probably the public sector over there in Mexico. Is that accurate?
Yes, because they opened up their upstream properties sort of in different categories, and they really wanted the technological expertise of the U.S. majors, the people who are active in deepwater Gulf of Mexico, to bring that technology, bring that capital down to help them sort of turn the tide on their existing offshore production, because that would give them a sort of an immediate boost turnaround to help mitigate their natural declines. They were all, they offered some property. There was some interest, but it wasn't a wholesale approach. It wasn't a wide open approach. They were much more wide open about natural gas and power. They're becoming much more flexible at refining. I suspect that over time, and as their capital requirements grow, their need for long-term partners grow, they will become much more wide open on the type of assets and properties they look at there. Not just water, not even water, but also export it all. There's a huge likelihood that the Eagle Ford Shale in South Texas extends over into northern Mexico, and that would create potentially a lot of natural gas resources very close to some of their large industrial cities like Monterey. It would be a great fit, but all this takes time and money.
Yes, it does. It does. Now, there are some who say that the oil production in the US does not matter much to the global oil markets. Is that an accurate analysis?
I don't believe so. I mean, I think we can see the impact of U.S. production just over the last 3 years as we went from 5 million to 6 million barrels a day all the way up to 9.6 million barrels a day. It did have a material impact on prices, on supply. It did sort of change the balance in the sense that the U.S. stopped importing crude from Nigeria and the North Sea, maintained imports from Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and Canada, but that was a quality issue. I think, welding or melding together the notion of crude production in the U.S. going up and the free ability to export that crude takes on added significance. And unfortunately, those rules weren't changed until very recently, so we didn't really see that when crude production was on its way up. But in the long term, that will be a very significant development in terms of balancing the Atlantic Basin and balancing the globe. I don't think the U.S. will ever be in a position where they're not importing some crude, but I think their net import-export balance already looks much leaner. And over time, you will see the U.S. become a significant exporter of light crude, a growing exporter of products, which you've already seen. So it has to have an impact because, it's not just the crude either. It's the refined products. It's the NGLs. They're making huge inroads. They're spending a tremendous amount of money investing in the capability of exporting propane, butane, ethane around the world. And that's something we really have never seen before.
That is true. That is very true. Now, looking at the current, energy pool that we have, different sources of energy, and the ability of the nation to use it effectively. In 2016, from your assessment, which nations you would say that are energy secure at this point?
Which nations are energy secure at this point?
Yes.
I would say very few. I would say that one could argue that the U.S. still has some vulnerability in that we still need a large volume of crude from Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Mexico to match our refining requirements for our sophisticated upgraded refineries in the Gulf Coast. So we clearly still can be touched by choke points in the Middle East, in Latin America. I would say the only country that feels truly energy independent would be something like Canada, where they have, the refining capacity, the petrochemical capacity, the natural gas production capacity, and the crude production capacity to be self-sufficient. Likewise, in Europe, only countries there I would think would be countries like Norway, who's very similar to Canada in that they have locally the refining petrochemical capacity and the molecules, both natural gas and crude, to supply those. But it's a very, very rare situation. I think the U.S. has made huge progress,
Yes.
but there's no way they could consider themselves energy secure when you have that sensitivity.
You're right, not yet. Very true, not yet. You are absolutely right. Now, the collapse of crude oil prices, where are the markets going, John?
Well, I try to avoid forecasting prices, but I will say this. The drop in prices had a lot to, slow down in demand in 2014. There was a great deal made about the war between Shale and OPEC and what have you, but at the end of the day, a lot of what occurred was sort of a confluence of events. That's a very convenient narrative. I'm not saying it didn't play a role, but it was one of many variables. Going forward, I think this market has found good support. That support may have been at $26, $28, $30, and certainly far lower than what people would have expected. But I think that we've seen a significant low put in place. That said, going forward, it's going to be a very different market environment. We do see abundant evidence through sharply reduced U.S. and non-OPEC production, through slower than expected OPEC supply growth, through persistently strong U.S. demand growth, that the market will begin rebalancing and begin destocking in the back half of this year for the first time since 2013. But it's going to be a long road ahead. But we also see at the same time a market where producers, particularly in North America and particularly in some of the more prolific shale basins like the Permian Basin, can make good internal rates of return at $55, $52, $58, or $60 WTI. And if that's the case, it means that prices don't have to go back to 70 or 80 or 90 to generate a huge rebound in shale, U.S., and non-OPEC supply. If that begins to be translated elsewhere, whether it's Argentina, whether it's Poland, whether it's China, anywhere that they've located shale reserves in abundance, it suggests that a weak market may be $25 to $30, but a very strong market may be more like 70 to 75. You could see a situation where over the next couple of years that oil demand gets a little bit ahead of oil supply because it's going to take some time, even with decent prices, for the U.S. oil industry to dial back up. And with these huge capital expenditure cuts we've seen across the board globally, there was a lot of big projects that have been put on hold, and there's a lot of lag time. So, the market could, on a temporary basis, sort of be tighter than expected. But it seems to me that the era of 80 or 90 or $100 crude is just not sustainable, given the advances in finding shale and manufacturing and mining shale, as I call it, the abundance of resources, and the fact that we always have hanging over us these technological and scientific advances that could be the game changers in terms of efficiency, automobiles, electric generation, electric storage, electric transmission, what have you.
Yes, that is absolutely true. Now let's talk about Japan for a minute. It seems that they have decided to close virtually all of its nuclear fleet. How have the energy markets been impacted by this decision?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we've seen since Fukushima, we've seen a pretty large pickup in utility fuel burn, in the sense that they've been using fuel oil, direct burning crude of certain grades that are of the waxy, low sulfur nature, and obviously picking it up on the LNG front as well. We did see some of those plants begin to come back, but obviously we're now going through a period where earthquakes are again a major factor there, a major problem there, and it could slow down toward the overall return. So Japan is going to be key, because it adds incrementally to the global oil demand, because basically you're having to burn fuel or crude oil to replace those lost nuclear generation capacity. It could help balance the LNG market, which is looking a little bit supply heavy with the new LNG export capacity in Australia, coupled with what we're seeing in the U.S. and what's being dialed up in the Middle East in particular. So it's significant. And, I would also point out to the fact that Germany, in response to Fukushima a few years ago, also really moved away from nuclear and went back to more traditional sourcing of hydrocarbons, whether it was crude oil, fuel, or natural gas. So the impact has been significant. It's been multi-year now, and given the events of just the last week or so in Japan with the earthquakes, it seems like it's an extended duration of their dependency on crude oil, fuel, and LNG.
Yes, that is very true. Now, if we talk about United States, we have one of the lowest average electricity prices, probably, if you look at all the developed countries. And that is probably because of the large fleet of nuclear plants that we have in United States. But it seems that some of the plants will be closing or are in the process of closing. What impact do you see because of that?
I think you have to look at it, the U.S. by region. So there's certain regions that are going to be affected adversely. So the West Coast would be a good example. They obviously lost the San Onofre nuclear power plant, could not be repaired, was closed permanently. So Southern California is without 2,500 megawatts right there. There's a growing debate over relicensing of the Diablo Canyon plant. That's still years away, but the fact that it's even being discussed worries some, because that's another 2,500 megawatts of capacity that's going to have to replace, that you just can't replace with solar or wind. That's going to have to be a significant amount of gas-fired generation being built on a grassroots basis. We've lost a lot of coal generation capacity in parts of the Midwest and the Southeast, but you can view those regions very differently, because in the Midwest you have sort of aging nuclear plants. I don't think there's a lot of imminent retirements, but there's certainly not a lot of new capacity. In the Southeast, it's quite different. You've lost a lot of coal plants, but there's about 5 nuclear power plants that are slated to come on stream, brand new units, over the next couple of years, starting in 2018, 2019, 2020, most in Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee. So each region has dealt with it very differently. But much like natural gas prices and to some extent power prices, you're going to see regional disparities. In places like Texas and the Southeast, power prices may remain low. In places like California and the Northeast and the Midwest, those prices could move up materially, both on an outright basis and relative to other parts of the country and other parts of the world.
Right, right. Now I agree with your assessment. That is very likely to happen. Now, we saw that Japan and Germany, they're, in the process of getting out of this nuclear power. At the same time, you will see that countries like China, they're increasing their nuclear power because they want to boost their energy security, and they have a big problem with the pollution. So they want to reduce emissions of air pollutants. So what is your assessment about this China's approach to power generation?
Well, I think China is, looking to move away from coal for obvious reasons from, a societal cost point of view, pollution point of view. There's the issue of them building a lot of nuclear power plants. You obviously have the big hydroelectric project, the Three Gorges Dam, I believe. And also, as you recall, it was about a year ago that China signed those long-term, they're theoretical at this point, but those long-term gas supply contracts with Russia to move natural gas down into China from Russia. So they're taking multiple steps, to ensure that they have a lot of abundant, cheap energy in the future, and energy that's not just based on coal, because if their cities aren't livable, it's kind of counterproductive. But we've seen instances lately where in certain parts of China, in certain regions, prices for natural gas have gotten very expensive. So you can see where they need to sort of invest locally and secure these sources from outside China to make sure that they don't have problems that sort of limit their economic growth, whether it's regionally, locally, or more macro across the country.
Yes.
So nuclear is part of it. Natural gas is part of it. We've also seen them in just electric transmission, to have much bigger and higher voltage lines to move power across the country, because much like we see in many places, there's a mismatch between where a lot of the abundant power is and where it's actually needed for manufacturing and population growth.
Right, right. Now, talking about the natural gas, it seems in Europe, natural gas cost almost 3 times more than what it costs here in United States. There is a very big debate going on about this. Where is the debate and energy policy decisions expected to go, especially from the perspective of natural gas?
I do think that's one area where the markets are working now, because just in the last 6 to 9 months, we've seen a fairly material drop in European gas prices, whether it's in the UK or some of the major hubs in Northwest Europe, like in the Netherlands. And we're seeing that sort of equalization. All of a sudden, the market's reflecting, the availability of Russian gas, the availability of LNG, the increased likelihood that U.S. LNG will be going to Europe, not Asia. So I do think finally there is some integration. They still trade at a premium to the U.S., but the premium now seems to be more in line with just the cost of freight and sort of the midstream or transportation nuances, and not some sort of regulatory, tax-driven, carbon-driven, artificial pricing. It does seem like we're getting to the point where these markets are becoming more closely tied, and that's really been a phenomenon of the last less than a year.
I see. So what future do you see of Russian natural gas exports?
Russian?
Yes.
I think they will be maintained. I mean, it's very important right now for Russia to maintain revenue on all fronts, and their crude oil production has been making slight gains and establishing new records, but it's on a fairly marginal basis. And I think the general view is that that's an area where they're going to be struggling to maintain production and maintain revenues. Natural gas is an area that works for them when they have good markets. So I think they're going to be more aggressive, but I think that that's a growth area for them. And I think that's also borne out in those longer-term deals we just talked about with China. Those were 20-year deals. There were, I think, at least 2 of them signed, and the volumes were very, very impressive in terms of scope. So I think they're seeing that natural gas has a very big future for them going forward, and they're making a lot of efforts there. Again, it comes back to one of our other questions too: will they wield it as a weapon going forward? I think that's increasingly less likely, because I just don't think they have the fiscal or financial luxury or ability to do that now. Things can change, but I don't think it's going to change anytime very soon.
Right, right. Now, let's go back to Iran for a minute. Now, it seems that they have a lot of internal political competition for power, and that absolutely, obviously, it impacts the energy industry and foreign policy. Uh, what impact do you see because of that on the geopolitics as well as the world energy markets, the internal politics of the Iran?
Well, the uncertainty there has been huge because obviously they're a big natural gas supplier. They're a big global exporter of methanol, and they're expected to grow leaps and bounds there in the post-sanctions era, and that's going to be a big fuel for petrochemical development and many other applications in markets east of Suez. But that uncertainty causes this confusion like we saw late last year. Who do you believe? Can you depend on what they say in terms of the type of volumes they're going to be producing? Do you have a high degree of confidence in their forecast that they're going to be at a certain level by a certain time? Right now, the answer would be no. We know that they're, have the opportunity to increase crude production and exports. We know they have the opportunity to increase petrochemical refined product exports. Do we have a great deal of confidence in timelines or volumes? No, and that's complicated by the fact that you just don't have that level of transparency because you really never know exactly who's pulling the levels because of the internal strife. That's true of other countries, but obviously right now, a lot of new incremental crude supplies for this year in particular, virtually all the new incremental crude supplies are expected to come from Iran. So it took on that much more gravitas because non-OPEC production outside Iran was flat and non-OPEC production was declining. So the inability to really get a handle on what Iran's going to do and achieve is very problematic for the markets and forecasting and planning, budgeting, everything.
Yes, very true, very true. Now, although energy is the most basic resource necessity across any nation or any industry, if you talk about it, the turbulent global consumer demand, falling oil prices, disruptive innovations, complex regulatory challenges, and rapidly changing energy technologies and processes in cyberspace, geospace, and space brings this industry great challenges and complexities. We didn't get much time to address today the technologies that we will be seeing in near future in the coming years from space. Or we couldn't, address the cybersecurity challenges and the integration challenges of cyberspace, geospace, and space. But these all, brings a lot of complex opportunities as well as challenges. Where do you see an energy industry going from here?
Well, obviously, all those technologies help in, I think, greatly in particularly the measurement and transportation of fuels, or energy, whether it's power, natural gas, oil, whether it's by pipeline, by wire, and by ship, and growing efficiencies there. Better understanding of how things get to market is going to be huge. Also, from a safety and environmental point of view, the ability to track every molecule now, the ability to know when there's a problem almost instantly is a big plus in the sense that you're not going to have as large environmental impacts when you have a negative event, whether it's a rail problem, a pipeline problem, a transmission problem, refinery problem. But as we were talking about earlier, there's a long way to go. I mean, right now, the industry is tremendously capital constrained. Their focus is on how to create revenue, how to create cash flow, how to cover debt service, how to cover their future capex to continuation of the process. So I think, unfortunately, they're probably falling behind par or behind where they could have been and where they would like to be on many of those areas. But obviously, those are all huge game changers because any one of those, if it can increase efficiencies, whether again it's from a transportation point of view or a technological point of view, or even in terms of discovery point of view, can make it seem like we have a much higher degree of supply in the market. If it's that much easier to get barrels or molecules or electrons from where they start to where they need it, seemingly you have more supply, even if the actual number is not changed.
Yes. Yes, that is very true. Now, John, this is your, you do this day in, day out. You are every hour keep an eye on the global markets. You study them. You analyze them. You try to come up with ways of managing the complex security challenges that arises in the global energy markets. What what keeps you really concerned? What are your most concerns at this point for the global energy markets? And if you had the power to change anything, what would you change in how the global energy markets operate?
I would, I'm a big fan of global energy markets and free markets in general. But I think from an industry point of view, whether you're a state-owned company or whether you're an international major or whether you're an independent producer, the focus should be on volumes. The focus should be on investment return and yield to your capital partners, whether it's investors, public and private equity, banks, what have you, and that you really need to not speculate. There's a rule for speculation. It provides liquidity. Again, I'm a proponent of the markets and free markets, but if you're running an oil company, big or small, state or public, private, the focus should be on, ramping up your volumes and becoming the most efficient manufacturer of those molecules. It's not about the commodity markets bailing you out. It's about your technology, your skills, your access to capital, and the person with the most efficient access to capital with a huge benefit, and the type of assets you own. It's focusing on the core business, your assets, the capital you need, and being the most efficient and getting those out of the ground into the market, because that's what's going to make your revenues and that's going to make your return. So there's been a great deal, I think, of lessons learned over the last 2 years about hoping, praying, speculating that the market's going to help you out. You need to be able to, survive even under, very trying market circumstances. Sometimes it's through surprises, sometimes it's through low price. But at the end of the day, it's about focusing on your core business.
Very true. Very, very good points and very good advice that you gave there, John. I really appreciate that you took so much time of your busy schedule and you came on Risk Roundup and you shared your analysis and your thoughts and your input about the global energy markets and how it impacts the security risk. So we really thank you for that. We are grateful that you came and share your thoughts. And I hope that as we do more research in the coming years and months, that you will be willing to come on Risk Roundup again and share your insights for the benefit of our global viewers and listeners. So thank you so much, John.
Thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation thoroughly, and all the best.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. Now, while the journey of hydrocarbons that started approximately 150 years ago to now has been filled with major controversies and very complex relationships, the truth remains, in spite of that, the truth remains that the nations still live in the fossil fuel age. Many oil-producing nations seem to be in visible turmoil today. If stability, security, and sustainability are to be achieved for the energy markets, it's very important to identify, evaluate, and understand the security risk facing the energy industry today and in the coming tomorrow. Evaluating the energy markets requires an integrated and interdisciplinary approach. Risk Group Cybersecurity Risk Research Center and Strategic Security Risk Research Centers are created for this very purpose and reason, so that we can collectively identify, evaluate, and manage the risk facing NGIOA in CGS, that means nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia in cyberspace, geospace, and space. And we can discuss, debate, and define necessary framework, structure, processes, tools, and technologies to manage the security risk of not only the digital global age, but also of the coming technological superconvergence. We at Risk Group believe that risk management, security, and peace walk together hand in hand. Though security is related to management of threats and peace to the management of conflict, risk management is related to management of security vulnerabilities as well as management of conflict. It's not possible to conceive any one of the three without the existence of the other two. All three concepts feed into each other. We believe that the security we build for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secure for everyone across nations. Tradition becomes our security. So if we build a culture of managing risk effectively, It will lead us to security, and security will lead us to peace. Let's manage the existing and emerging risks together. For more information on the Risk Roundups, to watch the Risk Roundup videos or hear the Risk Roundup podcast, please go to riskgroupllc.com, and do not forget to subscribe and share. Until next time, I'm Jayshree Pandya, host of Risk Roundup, signing off. See you next time. Thank you.